Hello everyone, this is Javera Atif and I'm back again with another episode of Policy Beats. Today I'm joined here by Professor Hyun Ma. He's an assistant professor at Frostburg State University. His teaching and research interests are Chinese history, Islam and Muslims of China, including Xinjiang, Sino-Middle East relations, China-Middle East, and China-Central Asian relations. Sir, thank you so much for taking out the time for this podcast. How are you and how do you feel?
Thank you so much for having me here. Always, it's a great pleasure to come to Pakistan and also to talk colleagues about international relations, China and Pakistan, Islamic world. Yeah, feeling great.
Thank you so much for taking out the time. So before I move on to this, I would like to know what was that starting point for you? What inspired you to join this field, to study and then continue to pursue this as a career?
Well, actually, I grew up in northwest China. I'm a Chinese Muslim. So naturally, you can imagine my interest, is about Islam, Muslim, China. So that's the family background. Then I finished my bachelor's degree in Beijing. I studied anthropology and ethnology. And also, I finished my master's degree in Beijing as well. Then I went to the United States to study history.
Oh,
so
interesting.
It's different. Yeah, I studied basically three disciplines: anthropology, ethnology, then history. And I studied at Georgetown University, and also you can imagine with a focus on Islam, China, and the intersection between China and Islam. So basically, I would define that, what I'm studying is China-Islamic world relations, both from a historical perspective and also I focus on contemporary issue. So you can imagine it's more like personal, family, academic, all interested, connected together.
Interesting. And I see that you're an assistant professor. How does that sort of, did you always want to teach?
Well, teaching is part of our duty as a professor in a U.S. university, especially in a public university. That's a big part of our requirement. And we teach like general history, world history, and I do teach like Asian history. I'm the only one in our department to teach like Asia.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it's about like a 1 billion population. And also I teach Chinese history, Japanese history, history of Asia. Then, of course, we do have some selected special courses with focus in like thematic research or something. So that's really, I would say, a large part of my duty. Now my research, as you just introduced, basically cover China, Islamic world. And also, in addition to my teaching research, I serve actually as the president of Zhenghe Forum.
Oh.
I don't know if you're familiar with Zhenghe.
I think I've seen their Twitter profile, actually.
Yeah, Zhenghe actually, he is the 15th century Chinese Master Admiral. He led the Chinese fleet to conduct not really global, I would say, Indo-Pacific navigation. Visited all the Southeast Asian countries, Bangladesh, and of course all the way to Middle East to East Africa. So he's the kind of iconic Chinese and Muslim. So that's why I just ran this forum. Now we basically built a permanent secretariat at ISTEC in Malaysia, and we just had the 6th forum in Malaysia in January. And inshallah, possibly in May or June, we're going to have an event with our Ibrahim, because he's an intellectual, Muslim intellectual, not only just the Prime Minister of Malaysia. So we want to talk about how to improve relationship between China as an emerging power, our superpower, and the Islamic world.
So drawing from your information that you just gave us, sir, when you study the cultural dynamics and having lived in China, having lived in the West, what sort of convergences do you see? Because in a world that is so globalized, and at the same time, we do see emerging, competitive trends as well. So on that front, what do you see multiculturalism being able to survive in the face of that, perhaps in your experiences? And also, I would extend my question a little, since we always talk about Pak-Chin Dosti, right? Pakistan-China friendship. And on that length, how do you think Pakistan-China relations can further strengthen the multicultural element? Because when you look at the people-to-people exchange, perhaps with the U.S., we still may have it more than our regional countries.
Right.
And that is essential in itself when it comes to having broader connectivity. You need to have people-to-people engagement, but be it in conflict resolution or even in peacetime initiatives.
Yeah.
So, sir, your take.
Well, the first question when you talk about multiculturalism, I do believe there is a multiculturalism even in the future, because multiculturalism at social or society level, we really talk about people's practice. So that's why if you're Chinese, if you're Muslim, you go to America, you naturally adopt some American institutions at least, and even some cultural elements. So that's why people naturally become multicultural.
Right.
That's definitely true. But when you just mentioned all this, especially recently, you have so-called deglobalization. It's more like a political. So that's why you see all this trade war. You see all this, what they call protectionism. You see populism. Basically, I would just say that kind of deglobalization is occurred at international level, especially between rival superpower.
Right.
So in this case, you do have a political deglobalization, but culturally, socially, I would just say multiculturalism is the trend and nobody really can change unless you totally cut off tie between people. That's impossible.
That's impossible.
Yeah. The second question you just talked about, China-Pakistan relationship at probably, cultural level. Yeah, this is really a very important question because when people talk about China, you're not really talking about, political friendship, a strategic cooperation,
Right.
economic investment. You also have to think about people-to-people's connection, as you just mentioned. For example, if you don't speak Chinese, it's really hard to communicate. If Chinese cannot speak Urdu, of course, you cannot really communicate. Even though we can communicate in English, but that's not really, help us understand each other truly from a local cultural
and then
perspective.
the language sensitivities that come along.
Yeah.
It's essential what a certain, I mean, from my understanding, because we only got to study like 2 levels of Chinese courses in our university. But that is obviously not enough for me to perhaps fully grasp the culture and the people. And I would understand that it would be a similar kind of setup if on the other end, perhaps in China, if we're not able to fully understand and grasp the cultural sensitivities of Pakistan.
Yeah, and definitely you are right. For example, I went to the United States in 2001. So you can imagine almost over 20 years, I cannot speak like native English, right? And also I speak like a little bit Arabic, Japanese, Korean, and other language because I'm required to study all this language. Even I'm taking Turkish language.
Oh, wow.
So that's why I know it's so difficult to understand not only like a culture, but at least, our language. You cannot really grasp the subtle meaning of all these, words, vocabulary, grammar, even tones, if you have, tones in language. So that's why here, for example, you do have Confucius Institute. You have a linguistic training, maybe 2 years, 3 years, I would say even 5 years, probably not enough.
Not enough.
Yeah, that's purely language. And also you have to think about culture.
Exactly.
Yeah, culture is more like, I would say deeper than language. If you don't have experience of living in China, if you don't have experience of interacting with Chinese, then I don't think you really can understand China. So that's why I realized, for example, in many Muslim countries, they talk about how we can promote relationship with China. Then when you look at their culture, activities, it's basically superficial language training. You do not really have like substantial cultural activity, engagement, society level, communication. That's a big challenge. That's the reason why I ran this Geneva Forum. I hope to bring intellectuals, politicians, and community leaders. Then, of course, when you have this kind of dialogue, people truly understand each other's concern, each other's question, right? So not simply say, well, I study Chinese, you study Urdu, so that would be
We're all good
difficult.
to go now.
Yeah.
I don't think that's how it works. And the reason why I asked this question is because fairly recently we started seeing people on Twitter. Digital media is an important tool to gauge
Yeah.
too these days. So just my personal study, seeing how Chinese diplomats posted in the Middle Eastern countries were actually sort of, they it's not cultural appropriation, that's a wrong thing to say, but they were actually making the right efforts to make sure the audience that they have to cater to is able to take them seriously. And I saw that sort of cultural adaptation, perhaps. And then I believe for the Middle Eastern side of the countries, since we recently saw that, all right, this is also a country that we need to be engaging with. Perhaps that sort of mindset is what's creating that almost sudden, which seems like an artificial means of communicating with China, perhaps. But sir, this also brings me to another question, slightly different, but also relevant, because when I ask what is the driving force behind the Chinese foreign policy when it comes to today's world, but I would also like you to perhaps share in more detail with regards to Middle East, since that is your subject. And in Middle East, we see different countries with their own sort of strategic lens that they're pursuing. Right. Turkey has something else going on. Saudi Arabia has something else. The UAE is pursuing a completely different policy than other Gulf nations. And apart from that, we also see a conflict-torn region, Syria, and recently with the earthquakes, the situation has exacerbated. So with all these circumstances that exist, what is the sort of tool that China is deploying in its foreign policy in this particular region? And what does it see could be the win-win cooperation for these countries and China?
Well, it's a really big topic, to talk about China's foreign policy. Because first of all, you have to think about China defines itself as a superpower, which means they really care about, United States, European Union, Japan. That's a traditional, foreign policy target.
Right.
And if you look at Chinese diplomats, these high-rank officials basically sent to America, European Union, Japan. So that means Middle East and other countries, you're not really on the top of Chinese foreign policy agenda. But it doesn't mean China ignore others, countries, because China is a rising global power.
Exactly.
You have global interest especially in neighbor country. So that's why if you look at the Chinese so-called the neighborhood foreign policy, they really try to reach out, for example, to Southeast Asia, to Central Asia. Then Middle East is more like extended neighborhood. But of course, Middle East is really complex in terms of politics, society, religion, and even historical relations.
Exactly.
So for Chinese interest, for Chinese strategic thinking, Chinese basically want to have a peaceful environment. Because I think in the past 40 years, China has really learned if you want to develop, you have to have peaceful environment. So that's why they always highlight peace and development are still the permanent, themes for international relations. But Middle Eastern countries, as you just mentioned, sectarian competition.
Exactly.
Geographic or geopolitical competition and political issue. So that's why it's really hard for China to, comprehensively reach out to the Middle East. Because you already have all the priorities. Western country, superpower. Used to be Soviet, but Soviet disappeared. Now you have all this Western power. European Union, Japan, but Middle Eastern country as a whole, I think China really want to, for example, through all this Belt Road Initiative, try to build infrastructure because this is what China is really good at. Second, all this country, they really need this basic infrastructure.
Right.
Third, they really don't have local, capability or capacity to do that. And of course, you have this global cooperation. China really need, for example, try to through Middle East to reach to Africa.
Right.
Through North Africa or minor region to Europe. So that's why you can imagine Middle East really is important for China's global reach out. So I think in the future, China probably will improve, especially the soft power. You just mentioned, for example, you have Japanese pop culture, you have Korean, pop culture, but we really don't see much Chinese culture influence in this region. So Confucius Institute is not really enough. So you have to, improve all this culture engagement with Middle East, because it's not simply about culture, it's also about religion.
Exactly.
So you should have not only just a scholarly exchange, but more like a societal, people to people's understanding of, each other's culture, religion, especially for Muslim country. In the Middle East, the religion is so important.
Interesting, sir. I mean, I know there's so much more I can, ask you just based on a country specific with China relation.
Yeah.
But that would be so unfair in this short time. So allow me to perhaps discuss a little on the Chinese perspective when it comes to Afghanistan, when it comes to its border security, when in terms of Central Asia. What are the current pointers that Chinese foreign policy is looking into? What sort of tools are they deploying in this part of the region? What are the goals to achieve here?
I think the primary Chinese concern about Central Asia or borderland countries is the security issue. Because here, when you talk about security issue, we're not simply starting to talk about terrorism. That's probably started from 2001 when you have United States invasion of Afghanistan.
Right.
Chinese actually started very early. After collapse of Soviet, we have all these, 5 Central Asian republics. They began to gain independence, which actually worried the Chinese. Because if you think about Turkic, minority in Xinjiang. So that's why in 1990s, actually, you already see the Chinese campaign against the so-called evil, or 3 evil forces, including extremism,
like the
terrorism.
SEO, the main, I recall the main part, not comments, but like sort of categories that they define in SEO. Yes.
And plus, of course, separatism. They worry about, because Chinese Xinjiang more, tied towards Central Asia, culturally, historically, ethnically. So that's why after collapse of Soviet, China always tried to prevent all this, separatism. The United States invasion of Afghanistan converted everything into terrorism. So that's why Chinese still concerned about all this, especially the Uyghur militant, no matter in Taliban forces or ISKP or other military organizations, or even by extension, you have all this, Uzbek, IMU, this Turkic.
ETIM and others.
Yeah, ETIM, that's the Uyghur, and also TIP, that's the Uyghur, but also think about Uzbekistan Islamic movement.
Yes.
So they are really tied to each other, in terms of ethnicity, and they speak basically Turkic language. So that's why I think China really concerned, this development, not simply for Chinese Uyghurs, because you have a large, ethnic brothers in Central Asia. So from Republic period to today's Taliban Afghanistan, I think China really worried about all this, Uyghur militant, either within, Taliban forces or in ISKP, Daesh. As you remember, probably, one of the Hazara Masjid was bombed by claimed, like a Uyghur terrorist. So that really shocked the world, not only, to the Chinese, but, people realized, wow, you really have a powerful Uyghur, militant operating in Afghanistan, not possibly in Waziristan, in Pakistan. So that's the purpose. But when you talk about, resources, I would just say it's very much limited for China. Unlike the United States, you have like a global military capacity.
Right.
And China does not really have, for example, remote controlled anti or counter-terror forces.
Okay.
China cannot simply, attack all these Uyghurs in Afghanistan like the United States does. Still, you have all this drone attack, right? So that's why I think for China, just want to maintain the security issue along borderland issue. A borderland region.
Sir, you trigger another curious question in me when you mention the Turkic ethnicity in the region. We've seen Turkey come up with the Council of Turkic States, yes. And then we also see a Russia-China presence in Central Asia. So with Turkey somewhat, making its space within the region, how does that cultural element create political or geopolitical difficulties for already two existing heavyweights of the region? Is China willing to I mean, is there already a mitigation of sorts going on? Seeing this sort of, I mean, we already have CSTO, the SCO, and then you have this.
Right.
So how does this sort of play into China's policy in the region then? Does it come as a challenge?
Well, I would just say, of course, for all these policymakers, they always, care about new dynamics, especially regional organization. But from my understandings, actually, in modern times, since collapse of Soviet Union in Central Asia, we don't really see powerful, weak separatists or separatism in China because China is powerful. And of course, you have powerful military, you have police, borderland, patrol. So you really do not have that kind of possibility. But of course, when you have all these, Turkic organizations, in terms of their relationship, especially I think Turkey offered a lot of military technology.
Exactly.
Drones to Kyrgyzstan, for example, that's China's immediate neighbor, and to other Turkic countries. You really created kind of space for Turkey, which means in Russia and China you have to I would say not really reduce some kind of space, but still you can imagine you have to limit your behavior in the region. But if you look at the whole Eurasian continent through the lens of history, I would say all Central Asian countries, no matter Turkic or Persian, they are more mercantile.
Okay.
That means actually, as long as you have more globalized communication or society, Central Asians are not only mercantile but also nomadic. So you do not really have powerful like a nation state
concept over there.
Yeah, because that's the really weapon used by Western country to mobilize people based on nationalism. In Central Asia, you both have like Muslims. It's more like a religious identity. You more have like, as I've just mentioned, all this commercial tradition. You also have all this nomadic tradition. So you do not really have, exact clear-cut like ethnic identity. So that's why I think in the future, if China really, reach out to Central Asia, probably you should encourage more globalization or at least regionalization.
Regionalization.
Yeah, to promote understanding, communication between Turkic population, Persian population, and of course South Asian population, Chinese. I think you can really create a new version of globalization, if you will.
All right.
Yeah, because globalization, I think one of the challenge to globalization is the nationalism. Or nowadays with the populism.
Exactly.
It's basically, you can imagine, in this nation-state country, we don't really see in Central Asia or Muslim country, you do not really have powerful nationalism. Because that's artificial, that's a social construct.
It doesn't work as it is with you see with Middle Eastern countries as a case study.
Yeah, when our population of people, right, you have so many countries, different political system. So that's really indicate nationalism will not really work. So that's why my expectation for Euro-Asia or Central Asia-China relationship is the more open, society you build, I think the more, a close relationship you have.
Right.
And of course, it's easier to get rid of terrorism or extremism. But if you try to counter terrorism through military means, you actually create more enemies. For example, if you just, attack one terrorist, right? Now you probably use missile or something, you just kill other people as well, possibly. Then you can imagine you creating more enemy. So for the long run, you can imagine more and more people actually begin to join with them, either for the purpose of revenge or, it's not simply terrorism. You have really complicated factors.
That is true. And sir, because I myself have an interest in Eurasian geopolitics, I would then continue to ask you.
Sure.
But seeing that we're short in time, I would just like to briefly ask you, once again, looking into China-Pakistan relations, coming back here, we talk about our regional, we talk about regionalism now, considering our national security policy. We wanted to have good relations with Central Asian countries. And then how do you see that sort of uplifting China-Pakistan relations?
Well, of course, I noticed that from Imran, Pakistan began to talk about economics, not really, geopolitics. That's, as I would say, fairly it's a good progress. But the difficulties are very clear. Given the size of Pakistani economy, And also, if you think about all the Central Asian countries, basically developing country,
Right.
not really economic power. If you have a neighbor like Japan, like South Korea, probably it's easy. But unfortunately, you don't have all these conditions. So that's why for me, of course, this is a beautiful print, like a blueprint, but it's really hard to implement. For example, Afghanistan, Pakistan. So what's the geo-economic mean? Geo-economic connection. You basically have similar, economic sectors, right? Agricultural products, they really cannot. So that's what I would think in the future. For example, Pakistan at least should at least make it easier for foreign investors, travelers to come to this country. Because, for example, when you look at Islamabad, I'm always asked by my friends, they say, oh, Islamabad is that big city? I say, well, it's really huge. But if you look at actually, for example, when you talk about like a hotel, I don't know, like a 2 or 3, 5-star hotel in Islamabad, that's unbelievable.
So people are still in awe to think that the structure still exists here.
We're not really talking about, it's economic issue. We really talk about why people don't come to Islamabad. Because if you have rich people to come to Islamabad, they prefer, to stay in 5-star hotel. But so here, you not only see infrastructure problem, but also you see all kinds of obstacles. For example, it's really difficult to get a visa, especially from Western country to Pakistan. Even for conference, you have to, submit materials. They ask more. Unbelievable. If you look at Indonesia, as far as I know, no matter Chinese or Americans, you just get at the airport. If you don't want it, that's okay, Malaysia basically the same. Southeast Asian countries, they basically so relaxed, They don't worry about any foreigner to come to their country. They're actually welcome. And of course, sometimes you do have some criminals, some, I don't know, like some elements.
I mean, 1 out of 10 could be a problem.
Yeah, that could be.
But essentially, we need to be improving conditions for people to come.
That's the very basic condition for opening up. For example, when China opened up like 40 years ago, all foreigners, it's so easy. You just, don't need visa or easy to get visa to come to China, right? So they want to travel. When they travel, they actually send money to you. But for Pakistan, you talk about geo-economy or geo-economics. If you look at all this operational level, all kinds of difficulties, unbelievable. Even if you think about Afghanistan, Pakistan, sometimes just shut up all this, borderline, checkpoint.
Yes.
And people say, wow, even Pakistan, Afghanistan cannot have a normal trade. How can you expect the whole region, right?
That is a reality check, and I hope that we're able to overcome these obstacles in due time. Because having lofty goals is one thing, but implementing and bearing fruit of those is another. And thank you so much, sir. As I said, that it's like a treasure mine for me to continue to ask you questions. But in this short time, you answered such big questions. I'm so thankful.
Thank you so
hope you
much.
enjoyed the discourse as well.
Thank you.